the the work we've done for the Community Wildfire Protection Plan with the village staff, and how that helped us understand what the wildfire risk in the village is. And then the next half of the presentation, understanding what FireSmart is and how you can approach FireSmart living in Lions Bay and integrating the important values of living in a community in the forest, such as Lions Bay, in a way that's resilient to wildfire. So the Community Wildfire Protection Plan is really the first phase in wildfire planning for local government. It's funded by a grant through the Community Resiliency Investment Program. And these documents are created for most communities in BC have one in some form or the other. And it's essentially a framework, it's a strategic plan for helping communities be prepared for a wildfire event. And to do that, we start off by trying to understand the wildfire risk profile for the community that we're working in. And so I think it's no surprise to everyone, Lions Bay is it's a community in the forest. What's a really big part of the character of the community is it's situated in the forest. And that makes it different from a lot of other communities where there is more developed urban cores with suburban areas and then farms and then acreages. Most communities have a very gradual shift from developed core to the forest, whereas Lions Bay is essentially everywhere is in the forest. And that's one of the key characteristics that we found through our work in the village of Lions Bay. I'm laughing because I know that's not a surprise to anyone. And so the first objective is to understand what the wildfire risk is in a community and what drives that wildfire risk, and then come up with recommendations to reduce the vulnerability if wildfire occurs, and then also to look forward to, as a community might change in the future, how can we influence that change to make it resilient to wildfire? So to set the stage at a big picture, the overall trend in wildfires across North America is they're increasing in size, intensity, and frequency, and they're becoming more and more of a problem. And British Columbia is no exception. There's some numbers up here, some big numbers of what's happened in the last decade. In the last 5 years, we've had our 3 worst fire seasons by pretty much every metric: cost, size, number of hectares burned, number of fires. And that's just in the last 5 years. And from 2010 to 2020, our fire activity was up 40% from the previous decade. And this is in large part, there's a lot of factors that are driving this, but a big part of this is climate change, which is driving hot, dry summers and earlier springs. And looking forward to 2080, so I know a very big forecast period, but this trend is probably going to continue across BC. Our summers are going to get warmer. They might get a moderately warmer to extremely warmer. We're going to see more summer droughts, and we're going to see reductions in summer precipitation up to 53%, which is a huge reduction. So this problem is probably going to be something that we're going to be dealing with for the next foreseeable future. But focusing in on Lions Bay, just a brief summary of the wildfire history. This is a map from our Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And as you can see, we have, I'll just turn the laser pointer on here. We've had 2 significant wildfires in the last 100 years, but those were both quite a while ago. They were in 1935 and 1960. And since then, all these dots represent very small fires that have been easy to put out, usually about 0.1 hectares. We have noticed in the last 10 years that these small fires are getting a little bit bigger before they're extinguished. But in general, it's a really small sample size, so we can't make we can maybe sort of say that fires are increasing in difficulty to manage, but that's more of a big picture across BC trend, and we can't really take that trend out of this map here. But most significantly, in 2019, I'm sure everyone remembers, there was a fairly significant wildfire off the highway, the Strip Creek wildfire, just outside of the area that we were studying. And that was a very challenging wildfire for the BC Wildfire Service to extinguish. And so when we think about wildfire risk, this is a key part of our work, is establishing this wildfire risk and creating this map. And wildfire risk for this purpose is a combination of the probability of wildfire and the consequences of wildfire. And so from this map, you can see there is a high, what we would call a high wildfire risk to the village of Lions Bay. And that's very typical of heavily forested communities on the coast where there's a lot of coniferous trees, which tend to be more flammable. And another factor is really steep slopes because fire does travel more rapidly and more intensely uphill, and it is more difficult to manage. And this type of character is very, very common for a community in BC where there's lots of forest and there's forest everywhere. And so one of the other components of our plan is to come up with a bunch of different recommendations. And so these are strategic in nature. We really focus on what the village staff can do and what's within the scope of local government to help manage the wildfire risk. And we kind of cast a wide net for what recommendations make sense. So this might include fuel management. I think there's been some work to protect critical infrastructure in Lions Bay. Signage, Lions Bay does see quite a few visitors during the fire months. So we want to have signage so that people who are, from the city and not aware of the risk can really easily understand that there is a risk in the forest at some points. Training for the fire departments and recommendations to build off the good work that they're doing. And then just some other recommendations that fit into the regular operations of the village, maintenance and things like that. But when we're dealing with a community like Lions Bay, where a lot of the wildfire risk is actually on private land, we really want to bring in residents, and we really want the local government to bring in residents, understand that they have a really key role in community wildfire mitigation, because it's really difficult for local governments to mitigate risk on private property. And that's why we have this program in British Columbia. So to switch gears a little bit, called FireSmart. And I find that FireSmart, us wildfire professionals, are pretty bad about using this term in a lot of different ways. So I want to start by just trying to flesh that out a little bit. So it's essentially what FireSmart is it's a program, and it's Canada-wide, but there is a BC kind of chapter of that. And it's for helping people understand how they can coexist in places where wildfire is an inherent risk. And that's most of BC. Most of the forests in BC are naturally prone to wildfire. And that's, people are attracted to living in the forests of BC, and that risk is part of living in the forest, and part of the values of living in the forest we have to understand how wildfire, being resilient to wildfire, integrates with that. And so FireSmart BC provides a huge amount of resources, really focusing on education and support for private property owners and homeowners and how they can coexist with that wildfire risk. And that term FireSmart, it's used as a noun and a verb. A house can be fire smart, a homeowner can be fire smarting. I'm sure you've heard people use this word in all sorts of different ways. And it means, the term really does mean different things to different people because of the way it's used all the time. And it's another way to think about it is FireSmart is living with and managing for wildfire in your area and on your property. And this is the graphic that FireSmart BC really likes to push out. And it is a good graphic in the details. Like, it's really helpful as a reference to understand certain components, but it's also really poor, I think, because this picture of a property that's maybe at a risk of wildfire, this is really unrealistic, I think, for a lot of places on the coast of BC. A lot of houses don't look like this, and they probably never will look like this. And I think we'd have a tough time finding a house in Lions Bay that looks like this. And I don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but just understand that this isn't the vision that you necessarily have to pursue when you're pursuing FireSmart. And I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you'll understand that this is a good place to look as a resource, but you don't have to make your house look like this to be safe from wildfire. So what is FireSmart really? The easiest way to think about it is it's a process, and it's a never-ending process, and it's not, and what I'd like to describe it basically in things that it's not, and it's not a binary. You're not either FireSmart or not FireSmart. And it's not a judgment. It's not a bad thing if you're not 100% FireSmart, if your property doesn't match that graphic I showed you earlier. And it's really important that you understand that it's really not one size fits all, this process. It's going to be different for everyone. Everyone has different properties. Everyone has different capabilities, and everyone has different appetites for the things that they're going to want to do. And so my suggestion as a way to think about FireSmart is how I suggest to people how they approach engaging in this process. Excuse me. So I suggest that anyone who's concerned about wildfire risk on their property starts by reading the FireSmart Homeowners Manual. It's on the front page of firesmartbc.ca. And it's a really excellent resource because it's written for homeowners. It's written in simple language. It's very approachable. There's lots of really good graphics and resources there. And it's a really good starting point for understanding what particular factors create vulnerabilities for homes in wildfire areas. And then once you've read that, you can try your hand at completing a FireSmart Home Ignition Zone Assessment Scorecard. If you can read the homeowner's manual, and I'm certain everyone here can read and understand that, you can probably complete one of these scorecards pretty easily too. They're really user-friendly. They're intended to be completed by homeowners. You don't need to be an expert to complete these. And once you finish that scorecard, you'll understand the big drivers of the score for your home. So the zone assessment scorecard gives you a numerical score, and it gives you certain ranges of values. And the idea is that once you have your score, you can understand what you need to do to get your home vulnerability to low. And what that means is that in the event of a wildfire, the vulnerability of your home will be low. And one of the things I'd really like to caution you is that expect to get a very high score on this card. It's very common for communities in the forest and properties embedded in the forest to have very high scores, but don't let that put you off. You have to start somewhere. And once you've identified those big drivers for your score, if it's really high, you can come up with a plan. And I really suggest starting with the easy stuff first. And that's the low-hanging fruit. It's stuff you might have to do anyway on your property. So obviously owning a property involves some degree of maintenance. Maybe you can adjust your maintenance slightly to integrate the FireSmart process. And so maybe that means you have a wood pile leaning against your house. Maybe next year when you're getting your fresh wood, you put it somewhere else or put it a little bit further away from your house, that sort of thing. And then the next step is once you kind of handle all that low-hanging fruit, and that's the stuff that might take, an afternoon or a couple hours, you start looking at maybe the bigger things. And so that might be, maybe you have a bunch of gaps in your deck where debris can accumulate or where embers could accumulate, or maybe you have an HVAC system that doesn't have a screen on it, so embers could get into your HVAC system. That's the kind of thing that you just want to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, maybe next time I'm at the hardware store or making an order of something, I'll throw in some mesh screening so I can put that on my HVAC. Or another option might be next time you're going around doing some tree pruning or something, you can integrate FireSmart principles into that. And then finally, we're always going to have these big projects as part of home ownership, replacing the decks, replacing the roofs, replacing the siding. You might have a huge dead tree beside your house you need to get rid of. And just when you're doing that stuff and you're planning those projects out, maybe just reference the FireSmart Homeowners Manual for how you can integrate FireSmart principles into those projects. So maybe you were thinking of cutting down this dead tree and replacing it with another nice Douglas fir. Well, maybe you can try planting an arbutus tree instead, or a big leaf maple, or something that's a little bit less flammable to replace that tree. So it's just those kind of things. I think no one is suggesting that we all go out and replace all the siding and decks of our homes. It's just integrating the FireSmart process as you have your normal process of home maintenance. And the fifth step is just constantly reassess. And when you're doing all your maintenance, just try and keep these principles in the back of your mind. And I know that probably sounds a little bit vague for now, so I'd like to work through an example with the group. And so you can see it's how I would suggest approaching this for a particular example. So in this example, we're gonna have to use our imaginations a little bit. So we're gonna pretend that this is my home, and this is the village of Lions Bay Fire Hall. So it's not actually a home. And I will also say that there's a different approach we use for assessing fire halls. And so what I'm doing right now is we're purely in fantasy land. So when I get a really high score here, or if I get a really high score, that doesn't actually mean anything because we're in fantasy land. And so I did a assessment of this property just a couple weeks ago, and the structure scored 165 points. And the threshold for extreme is 35. So that seems like a really shockingly high number if this was actually my home. And I might be really it might just seem like an overwhelming task because my score is 165 and I'm trying to get it to below 21. And that seems pretty daunting, but I'm gonna kind of work through my suggested approach, and maybe you'll see that it's really not anything too crazy. So the first thing I'm gonna look at is the small things. What are the small things that are maybe driving the score really high, or there are just like really easy to do? So this is the back of my imaginary house, and I have an old wood pile right beside the structure. And so that's something that can drive the score really high really quickly, is having combustible material like right up against the house. And so the first thing I'm going to do to manage my fantasy house here is I'm going to take an afternoon and I'm going to move all this stuff 1.5 meters away. Or maybe I'm going to move it out to like a central location a little bit further away from the house. It's probably going to take me a couple hours. And you can see here, there's some other stuff I should probably move out. But at the same time, that's probably something I would do at some point anyway. So it's not exactly a huge amount of additional work. And it's probably gonna take me an afternoon. So we have a couple hours. And so that one task reduces my score from 165 to 115. So in a couple hours, I've reduced my score by about 30%, which is a pretty massive reduction for really normal home maintenance. And so the next thing I'm gonna look at is I have these, I'll just get my laser pointer out again. I have these openings in the back for a dryer vent or an HVAC system of some type, and embers can get in through here in the event of a really big wildfire. And that's a really serious problem, to get a huge amount of embers into the structure. And so same thing, next time I'm at the hardware store, I'm gonna grab some metal mesh, I'm gonna screen that in. Probably will take me about an hour to screen these gaps in. And that's gonna reduce my score just a little bit, just 6 points, but everything counts. And so I'm down to 109. So I'm seeing some incremental progress here. And those are kind of the small things. And now looking at maybe some of the bigger things. And that's going to be the vegetation surrounding the home. So I'm lucky in my fake house here. I do have a pretty well-maintained landscaping around the house. There is some gaps, but at the same time, there is vegetation really close to the house, but I'm attached to that vegetation. I don't want to just clear cut around my house. I do have values in having, I don't want to live in a clear cut, right? And so I'm going to focus on some of maybe the smaller things that I can do really easily. So right here, I have about 2 meters from my house, there's a pine bush, and pines are pretty flammable. So I'm going to think about, I'm probably going to remove that and maybe replace it with a deciduous bush, like a boxwood or something like that, or maybe a Japanese maple. And then in the back of the house, I have some trees here. They're touching the siding, so that's not great. I want to create a little bit of separation here. So maybe after I plant my new bush in the front, I'm going to come back here with a pruning saw or some shears or something and create a little bit of space. And then I also have this coniferous tree here. And the tree itself is about 10 meters from the house, so it's okay. But the foliage is extending kind of close to the house. And I think at some point, I'm probably going to want to prune this up a little bit and create a little bit more separation. It's actually pretty good right now. Probably just have to take off a branch or two. And so that's probably going to be, that's a bit of a bigger project, I would say. That's probably going to take a couple days, or I might need some help from a neighbor. But when I do all this work, I've dropped my score from 109 and I'm down to 49. So a pretty significant drop with a couple days and maybe a couple afternoons of work. And now, so let's say I've gotten my neighbor to help me with my house, and he's going to ask me to help him with his. And we do the same thing on his property. And we do that with all our neighbors, and we all work together. And then now we've reduced the hazard in that zone from 10 meters to 30 meters. And that's going to get us down even further. And now we're going to be down to a moderate score. We're going to be down to, sorry, I just blocking it here. So I'm down to 29 now after doing all that work. And now I've done this easy stuff. I've done the medium stuff, but now I'm left with the big stuff. And this is where it gets a little bit challenging. And so one of the things I've noticed in my house is that, the siding has maybe seen some better days. It's wood siding, it's got some cracks in it. Maybe I'm starting to think about switching this siding out for a different material. Maybe it's at the end of its service life, or within the next 5 years, it's going to be at the end of its service life. And so when I go to replace this siding, instead of replacing it with, cedar shakes or some sort of cedar siding, I'm going to replace it with something that's non-combustible. And there are non-combustible products out there that do look identical to wood, but they do look identical to cedar. And so that's what I'm going to think about. Maybe not tackle that on for a couple of years until I absolutely have to. But once I do that, that final step, it's going to take my score down to 17. And I've gone from an original score of extreme down to a low vulnerability. And a lot of the steps along the way were pretty simple. They were things I was going to do anyway. Maybe there's some things I wasn't going to do anyway, but I decided to do for the purposes of FireSmart. But I really wasn't tackling this massive undertaking. I was trying to integrate it in the work I was already doing. And so hopefully that example was my fake house in Lions Bay was helpful for everyone. And just to wrap it up, I just like to talk about just a couple tips that I found working with people throughout BC and Alberta where they have challenges with FireSmart. Is the first tip is just, it's way easier to tackle this stuff as a team. It's a lot more enjoyable to take landscaping projects on with the help of your neighbors, and then you can return the favor later. And it's always a lot easier and a lot more pleasant to get some help. And the second thing, and I think this is one of the most important things, and I hope everyone can take this away, is that don't feel like your house has to be perfectly low vulnerability to wildfire. I strongly encourage that. We all strongly encourage that, but don't let that perfection be the enemy of good. Anything you do to reduce the vulnerability of your home using FireSmart principles is fantastic. And we really strongly encourage that. And then finally, the third tip is just start small. Don't try and tackle these huge projects. You might run out of steam pretty quickly. Maybe start by some of the suggestions I had earlier, some of your regular home maintenance, and just integrate FireSmart into that regular home maintenance first. And it's a process. When you live in a wildfire-prone environment, it's probably is going to be something you'll have to think about, and it's a never-ending process, and we encourage that. And I hope through this presentation, I've made it more approachable and made people realize how they can coexist with wildfire while still preserving some of the important values of their home. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the rest of the team, and we have lots of time here for questions. So fire away.
Connor, maybe I can start by asking you what experience or what can you pass on to people about insurance considerations, and my understanding is that the insurance companies are tackling this issue in a very concerted way across the country, and are actually creating mapping across the country, and will be taking into consideration the scores or the the vulnerability that properties have to wildfire when they are providing their insurance. And it's a process that I think it's a slow train coming, but my understanding it's coming for sure. Can you tell us anything about that, or what do you know about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. So it's all started, like many of the things that we talk about in wildfire, there's a curve, and the head of the curve is basically the United States, and we're kind of a little bit further behind them. And so generally what's happened there has ended up happening here. And so in the last 5 or 6 years in California, they've had numerous incidences of massive structure loss in wildfires and massive insured structure loss. And insurance companies in California have just stopped insuring homes in wildfire areas. There's just no mechanism for people to get insurance in certain areas, regardless of what you do. And obviously we're very far away from that happening, but that's what's really coloring the conversations we're having here in BC. And it's just starting. It started about 2 or 3 years ago, where they started really simply they wouldn't insure homes if there was an active wildfire within 30 kilometers. And that's kind of a silly way for them to approach it. And they've realized that because we don't have active wildfires in December and January. So just renew your insurance then, is what everyone did. And this is happening more in the interior and the Okanagan, where we have seen a lot of properties lost. But just now we have started, as wildfire consultants, we started getting requests from, it started with industry and with commercial real estate, where people have really large land holdings, their insurers have asked them for wildfire assessments, which basically consist of these fire smart assessments as kind of the structure. And then they require a professional like myself or one of my colleagues in the industry to complete a wildfire hazard assessment report if these homes are or these properties are scoring as extremely vulnerable to wildfire. So like Peter said, it hasn't quite hit the real estate, the residential properties yet, but it's a slow train coming for sure. That's just a fact. And I would say within the next 5 years, it'll be pretty ubiquitous in reinsuring homes in wildfire prone areas.
I have a question, if I may.
Absolutely.
I have another home in an area called Black Tusk Village, which is in SLRD, and that community is really gangbusters, all for Fire Smart. And actually, twice a year, as a community, we have Fire Smart days, where as the community we go around and gather up all our duff and deadfall, and both on our own properties and on common properties. And it's taken away to a transfer station. And SLRD also pays the residents a very small honorarium for jumping on board the Fire Smart train. Do you think this is something that the Village of Lions Bay might consider?
So I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Peter. That is something we did recommend and discussed in our community wildfire protection plan. And I will say one of the challenges with a community like Lions Bay and the way these things are structured is the SLRD can access exponentially more funds through the grant funding mechanism to support initiatives like that compared to a village. So there is a function of capacity and the funding available. So that's why they're able to do, the SLRD is doing a fantastic job. They do a really good job with this wildfire mitigation stuff, but they do have much deeper pockets than most of the smaller local governments will have for supporting these kind of things. And I guess I'll turn it over to Peter to see if he has anything to add.
Sorry. We did talk about some of these, we talked about that idea as well as several other different approaches that we can take at our last few emergency program committee meetings. And, some of those things include organizing community chip up days where we have arborists with their chippers and organize like on a Saturday or something, a particular neighborhood. And so we're going to be drilling down on that and looking for companies that are interested in partnering with us, perhaps giving us a bit of a break. Maybe we can engage them during their slow periods if they have any. So there's things like that. There are as well. There's more and more grant funding becoming available through the program that's administered on behalf of the province by the Union of BC Municipalities. And so there are things we want to look into in respect of those grant opportunities, both for fire smarting and contributing to things like community chip up days, as well as potentially addressing or trying to address some fuel reduction areas through fuel mitigation grants. And there are some recommendations within the community wildfire protection plan that I don't know if you want to speak to those, Connor, but those are more involved and require it's sort of another level of addressing those kinds of high risk areas with additional professional support. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit, Connor.
Yeah, so one of our recommendations is we identify some areas that are on public land that might be worth a closer look for fuel management. And so on Crown land, local governments have the ability to engage a professional, a forester, to create a fuel management prescription to reduce wildfire risk. And so that's kind of another phase of wildfire risk mitigation, kind of the next phase if the village were to pursue that. These end up being fairly large projects, so there is a question of capacity and of how the village wants to allocate their funds. But I think one of the pieces of the puzzle is the village can do what they can do on public land, and then they can support residents in doing what they can do on private land, and that's the fire smart stuff. And that's how the village really focuses on how they can support the kind of things you were saying. And our wildfire protection plan includes recommendations like that. And then it's just up to navigating the funding bodies and the various challenges of getting that type of work doing. And it's always getting that type of work, like those chipping days and those honorariums, getting them sorted out through the grant funding body. But it's a bit of an apples and oranges things when you're comparing what the village can do with what the SLRD can do, because I believe the SLRD actually has a couple of full-time staff members dedicated to organizing these events. So that really helps in accessing the grant funding and then also managing these projects and getting them all organized. Hopefully that was a helpful answer. I feel like we rambled a little bit and got a little sidetracked.
One of the other things that we had talked about in the emergency program committee meeting that we had recently was approaching BC Hydro about cleaning up their rights of way. Do you have any experience dealing with BC Hydro and how they manage their rights of way in terms of, like, you know, you hear the stories and you can see it in many instances where they'll hire somebody to come in and clear cut the right of way and just leave it, leave the deadfall there. So I don't know if that's something that Fire Smart organizers or provincial government and Wildfire BC are cognizant of, or if there's anything we can do to provide a little bit of pressure to make sure that that doesn't contribute to any risk that's in or around Lions Bay.
Yeah, so this is an issue in almost all of the communities we work with. Is people are unhappy with BC Hydro and the way they're managing their rights of ways, not only for wildfire because of the slash accumulation, but for a variety of different things. But the slash creation through utility maintenance is becoming a really hot issue throughout BC. And utility companies are under a ton of pressure and they're responding to that pressure. I know that BC Hydro is re-examining their policies for what's an acceptable slash to leave behind as part of their maintenance. I think so. They're moving in the right direction, but at the same time, they are just a huge organization, and they're almost these right of ways that BC Hydro almost sees them as their own little kingdoms, and it's hard to pressure them to change their management, and they're a slow organization to change. But to answer your question, they are moving in the right direction, and hopefully they can start implementing some of the new recommendations and new policies they're developing to reduce that slash that's getting accumulated.
Yeah, I have a question. A while ago, a couple of fires were on the BC right-of-way because of the sparking between the high voltage tension lines and the trees and so on. And the Paradise Valley, sorry, not the Paradise Valley, the Paradise, California forest fire started with high voltage tension sparks. And that's why also in California, they lowered down the electricity during high consuming to prevent these sparks. Basically, what I'm getting at is that because of the densification and the increased population growth, BC Hydro compensates, instead of bringing new expensive power lines down from the WAC Bennett Dam, they just up the voltage. And if you up and double and triple the voltage, what happens is the spark length then doubles and triples. And if the spark length doubles and triples, you get all these forest fires. So what's happening is in California, you get all these forest fires because of the electrical companies upping the voltage, because it's cheaper to upper the voltage than put new tension lines in just to compensate for the population growth. So, and the hydro companies, the electrical companies, they're the first to point towards global warming, where in fact it's their own fault for doubling and tripling the thing. That's the reason why the fires, and that's why also the fires by our tension lines like 5 years ago or whatever. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge, huge issue in California. There's several massive lawsuits happening because of these massive fires that have been exactly what you're saying. That's the exact issue. We haven't reached that point yet here.
Well, we've been putting him out. I noticed before the Paradise fire, the same type of arcing, high voltage arcing occurred here along our highway, and that's why we had fires there. And I don't know what the regulations are with respect to maximum voltage and so on, but if the voltage gets too high, you get arcing, you get forest fires. And that's why in California you get power, they shut down the electricity in areas to regulate the power so they don't get these forest fires. And if we don't put in new high tension lines, and we have population growth and increased densification, then we're going to get more forest fires. And it has nothing to do with global warming. It has to do with pointing the finger and blaming Cobalt because we don't want to be sued as an electrical company. And that's the thing, who bears the cost? Does the insurance company bear the cost, or does the electrical company bear the cost? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have an answer for you. I think your point is well taken, and I think you're pointing to a very alarming trend that is developing. I certainly hope that BC Hydro is aware of the vulnerabilities in what they're doing, and
they're aware, but it doesn't cost money and liabilities associated with admitting it. That's my thing. It's easier to point the finger at somebody else, and that's what I see. I don't know what the regulations are with respect to voltage and so on. The thing is, the cities and so on demand more electricity, with all the population, with all the new buildings going up along Broadway and so on in Vancouver. What's BC Hydro going to do? Are they going to double the voltage and create more forest fires just to provide electricity for those places? Because it is cheaper to do that. Price and cheapness overrides, common sense with respect to forest fires. So I'm trying to get this trade-off, or make people aware of this trade-off between voltage and common sense, and we need to give electricity to this new development along Broad Street or Broadway or whatever, because.
Thanks, Jan. Those are good points and things that it's helpful to be aware of for sure. And at any point in time when we have an opportunity to lobby and try to impress upon those who are in a position to influence or make decisions on things like that, we should certainly look for those opportunities. But I think probably, we should bring it back down to, the Lions Bay level, sort of more or less the purpose of the presentation tonight. Twofold, obviously, being a presentation of the Community Wildfire Protection Plan that Connor's pulled together, and as well as sort of the local fire smarting ideas and things that every homeowner can do in Lions Bay, individually, as well as, like Connor mentioned, with your neighbors, to really try to make a dent in the areas around you and the areas that are going to be most affecting your own level of risk for your own property. Certainly, anybody else have any further questions with respect to fire smarting principles or ideas for Lions Bay?
Just I want to say, you know, in addition to what Mary Brown was asking about, and Connor, your comments regarding larger municipalities and everything, I think the plan, you know, we need to do the things that we can do at the rate that we can do. You know, it's not like we're going to say, okay, by this time next year, you know, we're going to have an excellent score as a community or as everybody's houses. You know, I think this is a process that we start doing things that we can do. And I think over time, we'll start to see momentum build and understanding build of different concepts. And, you know, over the next few years, 2, 3, 4 years, you know, we'll have a lower rating maybe as a community, or certainly as you know, individual homeowners. But you got to take it in manageable chunks, and you got to manage the things that you can manage. You know, we can lobby other people and that type of thing, but you know, the thing you can do right now is clear away the firewood from your house, and you know, the simple things on your own property. So I think, you know, Peter, you're right. You know, that's the focus of this meeting, is to sort of get those general concepts out there and start that process of understanding what the simple things are that you can do to try and get your property in a better position.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the approach I suggest for residents, villages, towns, cities, regional districts, is you just have to start with what you can and do what you can on the timeframes you have available to you.
Anybody else got any questions for Connor or anything to add to the conversation regarding FireSmart? Or
I'd just like to bring up one thing, that in 1977, I was with the fire department. And there've been extensive, it was early in September, we had a long dry spell, and at Cypress, which is now Cypress Park, they were slash burning. The slash burning got out of control when a very strong sort of easterly wind came up, and the fire started going across until it jumping sort of various ridges until it was at the top of between Unnecessary Mountain and the Lions. And we could see the trees sort of lighting up along the top of the ridge, and it was blowing so hard, suddenly these great fireballs were going through the air. And they were landing in sort of random places around the mountain, and everywhere they landed, it would burst into flames. And at that stage, we thought we were going to have to evacuate the village. And but very fortunately, about 2 hours later, it started to rain torrentially, and everything was put out. So I think our biggest concern in the village is evacuation routes, because I think when things like this happen in a hurry, you need to know which way you can get out, such as going down Soundview, which has a gate across it and a gate at the bottom, which can get you on the highway. If you go along Mountain Drive below the tennis court, there are 65 homes along there that if they got cut off, they had no escape route. And quite a few years ago now, a tree came down across the road, bringing down the electrical line, and it was sort of sparking and causing a small fire. There was a person on the other side, coincidentally, who broken his leg and couldn't get out, so he was trapped in that area. But fortunately, you know, he was able to get out. But one of the problems we have in the village, or the main one I can see, is our evacuation routes. You have an area there that you can't get out. You're trapped if something happens. You go to the top of Kelvin Grove. That's again another street where you have no way of getting out. So I think we should put a lot more thought, to evacuation routes. I've been involved with making sort of easier access around the village with trails, but I feel that we need to pay a little more attention about that. I mean, we live at the top of Ocean View. We're also trapped if there's no alternate ways out.
That's a good comment there, John. And I've been working on the evacuation plan, and you bring up a really good point and something that I hadn't considered. If certain areas are cut off, there's so many different scenarios that we could have with the different areas that are cut off. I think, I'll start with just the basic evacuation routes, but that's really good comment, John. And I'll be giving that a little bit more thought as to, what we can do with regards to aiding evacuation to certain parts of the community that might be cut off.
Well, that's great. I mean, I've been working on this for quite a few years now with the fire department, with all the sort of relevant, including the village workyard, because we have some rights of way that would alleviate the problem along mountain, with a rights of way down to Bayview Place. But there's always been the concern about upsetting neighbors having a right of way that's existed for years, but they've never been affected by it. And I feel that we need to make steps now to, I know of 2 of them that could be opened up, to give people a better chance of getting out of the village. And I'd be prepared to share that information. I've got files of it here.
Thanks very much, John. Something that those comments bring to mind is the the ignition zone. If residents are diligent in addressing the risks around their own homes, then there's less likelihood of the ignition zone being within Lions Bay. That is the kind of scenario where, something gets out within the village. It can quickly result in people not having much time to get out. Whereas, if you got a wildfire that's coming across a ridge, or it's burning somewhere in electoral area A, and maybe it's going to come this way, everybody's got some opportunity for alerts and to be ready and to know where to go and when to go if they need to get out sooner than later. So I think that's another reason why it's really important for us to do what we can within and around Lions Bay in terms of reducing our wildfire risk, so that we don't have an ignition zone within the community. I don't know if that's something, Connor, I can't remember whether that's anything that's addressed within the Community Wildfire Protection Plan or not.
No, I think you've absolutely nailed it there. It's like one of the best defenses the community can have in the event of wildfire is just if those home ignition zones are taken care of.
Right. Okay, does anybody else have any questions for Connor, or any other thoughts to present with respect to FireSmart or the Community Wildfire Protection Plan? If not, then maybe we can wrap it up. And I certainly invite everyone to take some time to review the Wildfire Protection Plan, which is linked off the front page of our website right now from the current banner that we've got up, and go through it and familiarize yourself with it as well. Phil is working away diligently on the evacuation planning and some other matters as well. Mary and Leslie are diligently working away at Emergency Social Services, and so we're trying to pull all the pieces of the puzzle together and improve the safety and resiliency of the village of Lions Bay. And everybody's got a role to play, and hopefully we can all work in the same direction and see some accomplishments on an annual basis. We're going to work on pulling together an annual program and implementing some of the ideas that have been talked about, and some of the things that we can do to help residents help themselves. And so we hope to have more on that soon. Thank you again for coming out tonight, and thank you, Connor, for leading us through the presentation on the plan and on Fire Smart principles. The example with the fire hall I thought was really well done, and really illustrated quite well how we can chip away at things and improve our own scores for our own properties.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much again, Connor. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Connor.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.